everyone, Remix Review Guy here. I'll review remixes.
5, 6, 7, 8.
In this video we are looking at probably one of the most ostensibly good vibe obsessed alternative bands of the 21st century so far. The Go Team, the brainchild of multi-instrumentalist Ian Parton, featuring rapper Ninja, drummer Chief Fukami Taylor, and a whole truckload of vintage 20th century influences ranging from Northern Soul to 80s hip hop. Their debut album, Thunder Lightning Strike, reached its 20th anniversary last year, and they celebrated that with a full reissue program that also saw them trickle out a steady stream of new remixes from the album across the last year. It wasn't especially clear for a long time whether these new reworks were going to result in a full compilation at the end of it all, but they did. A very under the radar one got snuck out in February this year with pretty much no fanfare, apart from those brass sections that appear in most Go Team tracks. This low-key release does kind of smack of don't review me, but I want to do this one anyway because I'm still in full project review happy stuff mode after my video on The Cure, and it's also another chance to plug a gap in my music listening canon. I bought the band's breakout single Ladyflash back in 2004 and I saw them live at Hi-Fi Festival a couple of years later, but for some reason neither of those experiences resulted in me actually ever checking out their flagship album in full. Well, in this video we're going to take a deep dive to see what I missed, and then we'll take a look at what happens when Thunder Lightning strikes twice. One of the phrases I keep hearing to describe the Go Team's debut album is unique. And whilst I would broadly agree, having now listened to the album in full, it does feel like it coincides with a bunch of alternative music trends from the period. First thing to note is that sample-based music was in a bit of an interesting phase in the noughties. It seemed like everyone had got over the novelty of using chunks of someone else's song to make your own song, and the rise of MP3 file sharing had started to make people a little less fearful of the record companies suing everyone. The main precursor to a lot of sample-based music in the noughties was DJ Shadow's 1996 album Introducing, a landmark album that holds the Guinness World Record for being the first album to be entirely composed from samples. And yet, despite that novel approach and the album's roots in hip-hop, the results were a lot more emotional and immersive than many people might have thought possible. It went beyond the mere shock factor of using samples and focused much more on what the samples actually said when put together. And in the noughties, more artists started making music based off this model. On the darker, more underground side, you had Eamon Tobin, whose album Super Modified and Out From Outwhere piled jazz and cinematic samples into an industrial Blade Runner dystopia. Whilst on the cheerier, more mainstream side of the coin, you had the Avalanche's debut album Since I Left You, that outdid the number of samples featured on Introducing. Now, I mentioned that my first introduction to the Go Team was their single Ladyflash in 2004, and although Ian Parton claims that he was not inspired by the Avalanches for this album, it definitely gave me a context with which to understand what was going on in this song. The main thrust of this song is based on string samples from two different tracks. An ebbing drone from Down From Dover by Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood.
From Dover.
Followed by an arpeggio flourish from I Can't Rest by Fontella Bass. As the track goes along, it switches between these euphoric Northern Soul samples, old school hip hop acapellas and electropop samples, often in one breath. Now, to be fair, this is part of Parton's concept for the Go Team. He said in numerous interviews that he basically just wanted to smush a lot of his favourite music styles together. In terms of what those styles are, I think this clip from the Go Team's own documentary back in 2005 summarises it pretty efficiently.
Noisy sort of Sonic Youth guitars, double Dutch chants.
It's a romantic love.
Charlie Brown piano. Car chase kind of horns. All my favourite kinds of stuff.
Thanks, Ian. They're not necessarily all things that sound like they belong together, but then a lot of the time that's how new music styles are created, by taking that risk.
There will be people who will say, you don't mix this with that. And you will say, watch me. Watch me.
See, even techno knows. But for all its flavoursome ingredients, as a whole, Ladyflash does ultimately feel to me like a prototype for the Go Team sound. It starts big and just keeps throwing additional ideas in, one after the other, to try and make it seem incrementally bigger as it goes along. It culminates in this wonderful orchestral melody towards the end. And yet, something about the way the vocal samples are used in this song always makes it seem a little unfinished to me. They're too fragmented to create any clear verse-chorus structure throughout. But equally, they're also too lengthy to function as little sonic watermarks that you might find in hip-hop cut-up records. It's like you've got half a bridge, a bunch of chants and a chorus, and as much as it has a lot of elements that I like individually, this ultimately feels like an experiment in song construction rather than a fully fledged song in its own right. But a lot of the layering here is done to make this seem like it could conceivably be played by a band. And this is by design. Parton said this album was an attempt to effectively create the band of his dreams in sonic form. And on that basis, there is one album from the noughties that I would see as more of a precursor than Since I Left You, and that is Up in Flames by Caribou. This is from back when Caribou was known as Manitoba, before some handsome dick sued him, presumably for stealing all his groupies with a similar name. Caribou, aka Dan Snaith, is much more known for EDM these days, but back in 2003 he created one of the best psychedelic rock albums I've ever heard. Absolutely tons of samples, extensively layered to create this phenomenally huge sounding recording. There was a period when Caribou worked towards scaling these tracks down in order to make them more applicable for a live band, and this is what these tracks from Thunder Lightning Strike kind of remind me of. Whilst I doubt that Parton was inspired by Up in Flames, given that it was released only a year before his album came out, there feels like more overlap here than with the Avalanches. For all its psychedelia, Since I Left You is at heart a hip-hop album. Whereas from the very first track on Thunder Lightning Strike, Panther Dash, the Go Team feel ultimately more like a band. Panther Dash is a mostly instrumental rock jam that has theme tune written all over it. That brass riff in particular has the humble monotony of the classic Batman theme. Batman. A very similar vibe prevails in the track Junior Kickstart, another theme tune that starts off with some energy building guitar strumming. Before once again the action-packed Saturday morning hero cartoons vibe kicks in. This almost sounds like something that MF Doom would rap over if he had the dexterity of Twister. Probably my favourite instrumental on this album is Friendship Update, a much more mid-tempo number built around this pseudo Hammond organ riff. This one's less overtly theme tune-like, or if it is, then it's the theme tune for a sitcom rather than an animated show.
Taking a break from all your worries sure would help along.
But when I say that the Go Team reminds me more of Caribou than the Avalanches, that's generally because a lot of the more hip-hop feeling tracks on this album I find tend to be less successful. Take The Power Is On, for example, a track which has that overwrought, happy-clappy hip-hop vibe that you'd maybe get from one of the more balls-out tracks on Since I Left You, like Flight Tonight. but the sound here feels particularly oversaturated. It's entirely focused on the percussive elements and the cheerleader chants to the point where it feels very treble heavy and melodically rather slight. And consequently, this is one of my least favourite songs on the album, feeling kind of relentless without enough mid-range to take the edge off. This kind of links to another trend in noughties music, which is that a lot of debut albums had quite lo-fi recordings on them. Grizzly Bear's debut album featured a lot of instruments played via dictaphone. Folk eccentric Devendra Banhart recorded his debut largely on his friend's answer phone. Trumpian rabble-rouser Ariel Pink recorded a lot of his work on really old tech, using mouth noises as percussion. And beyond that, there are also artists like Tune Yards and Sleigh Bells who seem to deliberately lean into that overly loud, heavily compressed sound on their debuts. A lot of it seems to be that DIY bedroom pop was starting to become more and more of an accepted route in the age of file sharing and MySpace. So it seemed like people tended to lean more into that unpolished demo feel for their songs. Consider the sub 2 minute instrumental Feel Good by Numbers, a somewhat 50s sounding piano soul instrumental that feels like it's being played out of some sort of analog recording device. A similar recording aesthetic appears on the album's one concession to balladry, which is Hold Your Terror Close. It's basically just a piano and Chief Akami Taylor singing in this rather nursery rhyme style way. But her vocals are mixed like it's a 60s Beatles number. It's kind of cute, but just like Feel Good by Numbers, the effect I get from it is, alright, well, that happened. But other times that distorted feel just comes from the Go team pushing all the elements together to make this big wall of sound. Parton has shouted out My Bloody Valentine as being his favourite band of all time, and although there's very little in the ways of drones or shoegaze on Thunder Lightning Strike, you can definitely hear that influence in the way that it's mixed. Like on the track We Just Won't Be Defeated, which is easily one of the more knackering tracks I find to listen to here. Mainly due to these precocious shouted vocals. The band have used the genre cheerleader punk to describe their sound on occasion, but this feels like it goes beyond cheerleader and straight into drill sergeant. I do like the chorus on this one, particularly with that very catchy brass hook taken from a Syl Johnson record. But as the title implies, I feel like I'm in a fight with the Go team whenever I listen to this one, and if the goal is to get through the song, then I do often get defeated. More successful realisation of this idea of cheerleader punk comes in the form of Huddle Formation, with its bass line that was heavily indebted to Joy Division or The Cure. It's the closest you get to any kind of drone quality on any of these songs, even if it is still relentlessly joyous as everything else. But that industrial sheen actually makes the genre sound pretty credible. And whilst the Go team claim to be the sole progenitors of cheerleader punk, artists like Sleigh Bells and the Ting Tings have definitely carried the baton for pom-pom friendly music.
That's not my name. That's not my name.
And it even occasionally pops up in the charts now. But for all the album's aggressive sound, those moments when it properly leans into melody yield some of its best moments for me. Get It Together also has some advertently hip-hop references in it, particularly the drums, which sound like that 80s Art of Noise style, where every song sounded like it was being accompanied by a dancing transformer. Although here at least it's offset by this cartoon barnyard guitar line and what appears to be a children's flute section. As they offer this portable pocket alternative to the brass section, which is part of this recurring theme on this album of solos based around toy wind instruments. In in the context of the Go Team's towering soundscape, these instruments end up having a little bit of the scrappy-do about them. Too small to meaningfully engage in the fight, but absolutely 100% determined to have a crack at it nonetheless. Which, given that the Go Team are kind of an underdog band, does make sense. Still, there are a couple of tracks that I think this device works really well on, such as Bottle Rocket. Which is the one track on this entire project that really works for me. The brass and the guitar sound beautifully integrated, and there's a rap that's taken from a hip-hop song called the New York City Breakers.
And it's us girls running down a fucking rhyme, and this is how we introduce them one at a time. It's us girls running down a fucking rhyme, and this is how we introduce them one at a time.
It's buried, but the tone of it is just right. Old school, sassy, kind of casual in that Queen Latifah style way. And then there's the album's final track, Everyone's a VIP to Someone, and no matter how much of a miserable git I can be, I found it incredibly hard not to be seduced by this one. We have a banjo loop taken from, of all things, Neil Diamond's cover of Everybody's Talking as the foundation. Over this we get some old school movie strings, those great garage drums again. And the harmonica solo that sounds properly at home here. It's also a rare track on this album that has breathing room and the big filled out parts of the mix feel earned rather than you being dropped straight into them. But yeah, great track title, and the music actually matches it. So that is Thunder Lightning Strike. In some ways a unique and singular record, but in other ways a convergence point in 2005 for alternative music. It's an album with a lot of interesting musical ideas in it, but it is ultimately an album that I admired more than I enjoyed. Part of the reasons why this didn't land for me were fairly predictable. It's an aggressively cheerful album, and I'm not an aggressively cheerful person. But really, the biggest stumbling block I found for this project is, despite its status as a classic album, this sounds like a debut to me. When I reviewed Moon Safari by Air the other month, what really impressed me about it was just how confident and accomplished the overall album sounded. If you'd have told me that was Air's second or third album, I wouldn't have batted an eyelid. By contrast, Thunder Lightning Strike sounds like a lot of debuts to me, in that it sounds like someone throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. But at the same time, Parton says that his vision was to create his own musical utopia, and as he admits, utopia is a very personal thing. Heaven isn't for everyone. So with that in mind, how do you remix one's personal utopia? First thing to note about Thunder Lightning Strike Remixed is that it's not the first time this album has had a remix collection. On their Bandcamp there's an EP titled Thunder Lightning Strike Remixes and Bonus Tracks. It comprises all the remixes from that original run of singles from the likes of Simeon Mobile Disco, Hot Chip, RJD2 and Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine, all of whom were either established or very much on the up at the time. And listening to these reworks now in 2025, I think it's fair to say that none of these artists really got the Go Team sound back then. Some of them get a bit overwhelmed trying to untangle the elaborate sample tapestry and turn out versions that actually end up kind of threadbare. Whilst others try and outdo the Go Team's manic energy and just come across as plainly obnoxious in the process. This time around, the selection of remixers feels a lot more hand-picked by the Go Team, and ultimately more representative of the cross-section of Bandcamp DIY rock artists akin to the Go Team's origins. The album opens with one of two remixes of Hold Your Terror Close, this one by a band called the Orielles. Their original work seems to flit between 90s style indie rock
Am I the maker of this tableau? A frame
and more electronic ambient and dance experiments. And this remix nicely bridges the gap between those differing interests, wryly fastening the song into a pint-sized New Order style ballad. I quite like the way Taylor's vocal has been fit into this vibe, particularly with the stutters on the vocals that give it a bit of a Charlie XCX feel. This version's dreamy and more overtly mature than the original version, which I can see being a bit of a sticking point if the infant vibes were what you appreciated about that version. It does make for a weirdly low-key start to this remix album, although not as low-key as the Andrew Wasylyk remix of Panther Dash. Wasylyk is a composer of cinematic lounge jazz. And here he transposes the brassy hook of the original into a snail-paced jazz trudge, which effectively reshapes it into a panther crawl. There are some lovely instrumental touches on this, particularly the way his own flute reinterprets the melodica sections from the original, as well as some chill light piano. My one beef with this remix is that both the riff and the beat sound like they've been artificially slowed down, like a record playing at the wrong speed. Deliberately slowed records always sound a bit too uncanny for me, and whilst I'm sure Vaporwave Go Team is a vibe that someone out there wants, for me this kind of aesthetic sounds too much like a John Peel admin error for me to enjoy it. The third track here is a remix of Ladyflash by Monster Rally, and it's the first track on this album that explicitly retains some obvious Go Team signifiers. Despite the promising name though, Monster Rally are actually not some kind of exciting post-punk act, but instead a lo-fi hip-hop artist. And their version of Ladyflash effectively just nurses those opening string samples at a slower pace. With a slightly more refined beat, occasionally switching to the backing piano samples. It's entirely instrumental with very few flourishes other than some occasional EQ filtering. And there's a light snippet of the flutes right at the end when there's no more time to actually enjoy them. I can dig it in terms of it being a functional hip-hop tool, but in the context of this album it feels kind of low effort and just sort of exists. And as such, these first 3 tracks do make for something of an underwhelming start to the album overall, suggesting that mild, easy listening adult contemporary The Go Team is the watchword on this occasion. Thankfully though, things start to pick up with the Teebs remix of Get It Together. Teebs is also a beat maker, but I found his production on his own records a lot more involved and elaborate in the sound design. And whilst his rework similarly focuses on the original elements, the redistribution of them seems a lot more purposeful. It builds in a more measured way that makes this one feel particularly bittersweet, like it's a past tense version of the original song. Fragments of memories of the original just popping up before they eventually come into sharp focus towards the end of the track. And looking on YouTube, this remix seems to have proven particularly emotional for people due to the fact that the original featured in the game Little Big Planet, which was taken down in 2024. But this is the first remix on the album that really feels like a proper nuts and bolts rework of the original elements, and it works fabulously on that basis. But as much as the Go Team's hip-hop leanings are well represented on this compilation, we follow this remix with 2 more rock-oriented interpretations that are effectively cover versions. We get the album's other take on Hold Your Terror Close, courtesy of the Pastels, whose own work regularly resides in wistful, down-tempo indie rock.
Check my heart, check your heart.
And we get a particularly intimate rendition of that vibe here, offering up this breathy, almost Sparkle Horse-esque vibe.
It can be better than that, but wait until...
For me, this is the superior of the two versions. It occasionally sails a little too close to the Son of Coffee Shop soundtracks for me, but it's a beautiful version overall, and I love the way the brass opens out as the track goes along. It also features my favourite intro of any remix I've heard so far this year, sampling Taylor's original count-in at the beginning, but then adapting it to their own time signature.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Then we have a rework of Junior Kickstart by another artist with a fantastic name, Lost Bitchos, who, as you can probably tell from those syllables, are from London. They're an instrumental four-piece inspired by global rock sounds, of which I particularly hear African influences like Afrobeat or soukous. It's solid enough, but something about this beat-ready instrumental rock music always just makes me think of the Shadows, which is a bit unfortunate. But something about their Go Team rework really clicks for me. They interpolate the various melodies of the Go Team's original into this wonderfully 80s charged instrumental that almost sounds like something I'd hear Grace Jones waxing lyrical over. It's all very smooth and very tight and very vibrant, from those slightly obtuse drum patterns to those stabs that augment the 80s feel really nicely. And just when the track feels like it's revealed its entire hand, there's a last-minute tempo shift. Which is a magnificently sprightly coda and an excellent way of rounding this track off. Then with track 7 we get the one remixer I had the most familiarity with going into this review, which was Cornershop. Largely for the same reason that I imagine most people do, which is of course brimful of Asher. A classic example of a remix breaking through into the mainstream thanks to Norman Cook. You may have wondered why you don't hear that much from this band in the mainstream outside of that song, and honestly the reason is their sound is just so dreary. Listening to their most recent album, England is a Garden, every track they do just seems to chug along at this tedious mid-tempo pace, utilising the same disinterested chord progressions throughout.
They follow Pepsi and Judas, policemen follow them.
I'm sure the social commentary and the lyrics on this album is pretty timely, but I really can't stay awake on any of these songs long enough to find out. Their rendition of Everyone's a VIP to Someone effectively sounds like a YouTube drum cover of the song, with all the melodic and harmonic elements that made the original such a belter just smothered in the mix. And every now and then you hear this vocal sample go,
Love is amazing.
It's maybe enjoyably stupid on its first iteration, but by the 5th time it becomes just needlessly annoying. Like your friend who has that one catchphrase they try to squirrel into every conversation unceremoniously.
Love is amazing. Love is amazing. Love is amazing.
It just makes me feel like Jesse Lee Peterson's wandered in to do some MCing.
Y'all may take away the N-word, but you ain't take away amazing.
I guess it's not all bad though. There's a fun little Billie Jean interpolation. The album gets on track fairly soon afterwards though, courtesy of Louie Zong's version of Feel Good by Numbers. Now, even though Cornershop has the biggest song out of any of the remixers here, Louie Zong is easily the biggest artist, having over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. His approach is a bit more conceptual. and his version of Feel Good by Numbers fleshes out the song admirably, playing around with the up and down momentum of the song repeatedly, and adding this fun piano refrain that sounds like a very cheap Casio but backed up with guitar. Like the original, it feels kind of theme tune-esque, perhaps for some sort of cheesy restaurant advert. Not necessarily my favourite remix on the album, as some of the sounds are a little too elevator music for me, but as a development of the minimal composition of the original, I respect this one a lot. Then the penultimate track is one of the biggest curveballs on the album, as it's a remix of Air Raid GTR by Lilien Rosarian. You may have noticed that I didn't review the original version in the first part of this video, and that's because it's literally just 40 seconds of air raid siren noises. Although, as air raid siren noises go, I'd say they're a solid 6 out of 10. You may be wondering how Rosarian remixes this given the incredibly meagre source material, and the truth is, she doesn't. In terms of her own work, she basically fits into what Wire magazine have clunkily labelled as hauntology, a loosely defined sample-based movement that includes artists who basically try and make music that feels like a hazy memory of old sounds. And that is the process that she gives here, as rather than doing an actual remix of Air Raid GTR, she effectively makes it a mega mix of a whole bunch of different tracks from Thunder Lightning Strike. Instead of going down the ambient route, she's taken it in a more cold cut style, beats and pieces, hip hop cut up direction. I don't know exactly how many of the tracks ended up being put into this, although I did pick out the banjo from VIP, the horns from We Just Won't Be Defeated, the drum beat from Get It Together, and fragments of Hold Your Terror Close. It's a really neat little exercise in ensemble cut-ups that actually ends up being one of the album's most gung-ho tracks. In concept, this feels like it should perhaps have been the closing track of the album, but instead that honour is given over to CV Vision with his version of We Just Won't Be Defeated. Despite sounding like an employment website, CV Vision is actually a psych rock revivalist artist. Not dissimilar to a few of the artists here, although he is occasionally inclined towards more electronic elements here and there. And on this remix, he whips up the right balance of electronic elements and samples from the original, with bubbling arpeggiators and scratchy beats that give this track the fizzy sound of 90s breakfast cereal. In fact, this track kind of reminds me of Sophie's whole mantra of synthesizing sounds to sound like materials, and this remix does sound almost like it's constructed a set of superheroes out of Rice Krispies. The verses on this one mangle the shouting from the original into what sounds kind of like a Cypress Hill style record scratch but with more residue, and that makes it a lot more palatable for me given that I couldn't understand what the original lyrics were anyway. But this remix is keen to keep the melodic elements flowing from the nicely deployed original guitar samples on the second verse. To some wonderful synth pop wistfulness towards the end. But yeah, this remix is very successful for me, a lovely and strangely coherent smorgasbord of sounds. Anyways, that is Thunder Lightning Strike Remixed, an album that I must admit it took me a while to really get a handle on. The fact that this collection was rolled out on a one track a month basis for an extended period of time and then dumped into an album format with barely any promo, I think definitely coloured my perception of this record to begin with. But the more I've listened to it, the more I think this collection is actually kind of special. The original Thunder Lightning Strike is chock full of nice details and fun ideas, but It's so in your face in the way it presents them that I actually found it kind of difficult to appreciate them outright. These remixes largely serve to show that underneath all the 60s style mixing and bombardment of jollity, there's actually some damn nice songs here that work really well with a less OTT vibe. In terms of my favourite track on this album, well, I'm certainly not short of options. As far as honourable mentions go, I would say Teebs' version of Get It Together stands out as being an instance of a track just intelligently and elegantly reconfigured into something more emotive in a pleasingly subtle variation. And I'd also shout out CV Vision's version of We Just Won't Be Defeated for taking what I found to be one of the most exhausting songs from the original and pleasingly softening those elements whilst largely retaining the original's energy. But overall favourite for me was the Lost Bitchos rework of Junior Kickstart. On paper, not one that I would have expected to enjoy anywhere near as much as I did, but just in terms of sheer force of nature, I found this one the most addictive out of all of the reworks here. Least favourite remix for me was the Cornershop version of Everyone's a VIP to Someone. By no means the easiest song to remix given how strong the original is, but this rendition felt like it gave up the game pretty early, and just resorted to drum practice and irritating sound bites in the hope of making some impact on the song. And is this collection of remixes better than the original? Kinda. This album hits a not dissimilar spot to the vegan version of Air that I reviewed earlier in the year, in that it sort of sounds like a post-Innocence version of the band's sound that gives it a kind of retrospective, emotive, almost melancholic feel, but in a good way. It is fair to say that some of the album's original tracks are just too unique in vibe to be easily improved in remix form, and I do think it is very notable that both Bottle Rocket and Huddle Formation don't get reworked on this album. But honestly, this remix album surprised me in just how much it grew on me, and I think the layout of the tracklist definitely helps in that regard. Starting kind of ambient before sliding into rockier territory and then ending on hip hop. In some ways it makes for a more coherent listen than the original version does. And with an artist like Parton, whose compositional process is all about putting all the music he likes into his own music, it's only fitting that we finally get a remix companion that hands over the stems to all of the artists that he likes. Anyways, that is my review. Have you heard the original album or the remixed version? What did you think? Do you agree with my opinions? Disagree with my opinions? No opinion on my opinions? Let me know in the comments below. If there are any other remix releases in the near future you think I ought to cover, then let me know as well, and do subscribe to the channel if you want to see more remix based content. Thank you very much for watching. This video is over.
That boy needs therapy.
That was amazing.
That boy needs therapy.
That was amazing.
That boy needs therapy.